Good afternoon, everyone. I'm a little late getting a chapter a day up today. I got some excellent news this morning, and I've kind of been dancing around the house. I have been longlisted, and so has this beauty, home again, for the Devon and Cornwall International Novel Prize. And what makes this incredibly wonderful for me is that number one, it's an international prize. And I'm long listed. And it's a novel prize. It's not a romance novel, it's not a woman's fiction novel, it's all novels that they considered. So I'm really thrilled by that. There are 16 on the long list. Again, thrilled by that. And I'm hoping, praying, and doing whatever else I can to ensure, which I have no control over at this point, but I certainly want to be shortlisted. And shortlisted means 3, and from there I want to win. That being said, I'm incredibly happy with this news, and I'm going to mark it and celebrate it. So when we're done here, I'm going to run and buy a nice bottle of champagne, and if I can't find one of those, I'm going to buy a really good bottle of bourbon, and I'm going to celebrate tomorrow with the man that I love. So super excited. Thumbs up, guys. Think about that thing and just send all the energy you've got out into the universe. All right, so chapter 14. Well, will I be all right? Garrett asked again. He was looking at Zephyr Talbot with challenge in his eyes, but it was Poppy who answered him. Zephyr let Poppy take over, mainly because Zephyr learned more by watching and listening. The Three of Pentacles indicate material success in your field, where you are now. You've achieved recognition for your craft, and you've been well paid for it. Poppy was looking at the cards as she said this, as if she were seeing the words written out for her. Garrett said nothing. Anyone who read his Wikipedia page knew that. Then she pierced him with her clear blue eyes. It was almost as if she were looking into him, seeing what fears and strengths lay within his heart and touched his soul. She was sending out fine lines of invisible electricity that shot straight to him, making his blood buzz and hum with life. He was attracted to her. He knew that within seconds of seeing her again. And Garrett Oakley was no stranger to attraction. This energy was different. It burned. It pulled. It excited him and made him want to see her naked as quickly as possible. It also scared him, because deep down he knew he wanted to hold her next to him far longer than one night, 1 month, or 1 summer. Poppy Hanson was the kind of woman he wanted for a lifetime. She was the kind of woman he could love for far longer than that. And that scared him deeply. He was afraid irrevocably. Suddenly he wanted to flee. Poppy was having none of it. She nailed him to his seat with the force of her gaze and something intangible being woven between them. He knew by the sudden widening of her eyes and the quickness of her breath that she too felt the pull of that hot, sensual energy. He smiled slowly, with intent, feeling like a predator dancing with its prey. That was quite accurate. He did feel the urge to taste her. Poppy startled at his open desire. He had her off her game. That made him sit up a little straighter in his chair. Garrett hadn't flirted with a woman he actually wanted in his bed in a long time. Poppy threw metaphorical ice on him. Her aim was excellent. It didn't just hit his head, it hit his chest, focusing to the left where his heart was supposed to be. And she did it looking him square in the eye with a look that said she believed the cards were true, and they were unsettling for her as well as him. Swords are the most powerful and potentially dangerous of the suits. The 5 can mean instability, conflict, loss, or... She paused a moment, but her gaze remained locked on his. Opportunity. None of that sounded particularly inviting. Opportunity for what? He asked. Change. Garrett thought that was about as clear as cement. About as fluid, too. Everything changed. Sometimes in the blink of an eye. Change was certain. Opportunity was not. He decided he'd take the opportunity part of that, even with the risk of instability and conflict. His life was already unstable. Much of that by his own hand. Garrett narrowed his eyes as he scrutinized Poppy's posture and demeanor. She wasn't immune to him. That was obvious. She didn't look as guarded as she had this morning when he'd gotten off the bike. That may have had something to do with the fact that at that point he wanted to fight over those damn letters and her interference with his life. Until he saw her face. Now the idea of a little conflict with her didn't seem so bad. If it led to the opportunity to hold her, to explore her with his hands and his lips. He hadn't felt the urgent need to kiss a woman as he felt now since he was a teenager. And the last card? He asked, his voice a deep rumble. Does the 6 of Swords mean more enhanced instability, conflict, and loss? Does it increase my opportunity? He managed to imbue the last with what he hoped wasn't a nuanced suggestion. No, Poppy said with something like trepidation flashing momentarily in her eyes. 6s suggest heightened communication, problem solving, and... Her pauses, whether intentional or not, said a lot about how she was reading him. And, he prompted, anxious to hear her answer. And cooperation. Great. He'd take some cooperation after a little light conflict with Poppy. He didn't look too hard at the fact that his interpretation of Poppy's readings had everything to do with foreplay and little to do with his life path. Right now, foreplay was far more palatable as a goal than anything else he cared to contemplate. Garrett leaned forward into the table. Astrid let go of his hand. Garrett's gaze shot to the little girl as she moved around the table to sit on her mother's lap. He hadn't held hands for that long a duration with anyone. The fact that it seemed normal jolted him, knocked him off his game a bit. Dogs and children were devious creatures, he decided. They wormed their way into your heart, changing you in ways that made hand-holding and heart-enhanced bling collar buying routine. He could rail against it, or he could accept that in this he was, always had been, and always would be, completely vulnerable. There were some gifts from above one just didn't turn away. His first day home, and he'd encountered 2. Apparently his opportunity for change had already begun. The look on Poppy's face said there was more he hadn't been told. Okay, let's have it. There's something you're not telling me. Is it the cards taken as a whole? Is it that if I don't do something I'm going to hate doing, I'll be struck by lightning? Astrid beamed at him like he was the best reader in kindergarten. She did everything but clap her hands at his brilliance. Garrett couldn't help but grin. He liked this kid a lot. This is the sun and the moon and the stars, Astrid said, as if that made perfect sense. She pointed to the first card he turned over, the 3 of Pentacles. This is where you are now. She nodded emphatically at him, losing her smile and bringing her eyebrows together to indicate her seriousness. You have a good job. People listen to you. You have money. This is how people see you. That had been true last week. He had no idea if anyone would listen to what he had to say now. Astrid pointed to the second card. The card of conflict, loss, instability, and with any luck, opportunity. This is what's coming next. It's not as scary as it looks. Astrid looked from the card to him, a slight frown marring her brow. She had her mother's eyes, compassionate, intelligent, and filled with something ephemeral that told him both were closer to true goodness than he'd ever be. Don't worry. Change is hard. Sometimes you have to lose stuff to find better stuff. Astrid put one chubby finger on the last card. This is where you'll end up. It's a good card. Cooperation and communication are good problem-solving techniques. She nodded. Then she continued emphatically, Robert always says that. Robert, his dad, the great communicator. Heaven help me. Garrett tamped down his irritation that his father had obviously earned Astrid's love and respect. She even quoted him for Pete's sake, probably totally unaware that that little tidbit of questionable genius came directly from his book. It was the title of chapter 2. He didn't know who he was more irritated with, his younger, successful, self-assured, pedantic self, or his father for quoting his pontificating ass to an impressionable child. Garrett sighed. Both, if he were honest, mainly himself. Sometimes his old self got something right. That was strangely irritating. It was also reassuring. I guess this means I'll be welcome for dinner, then I'll say or do something to create conflict, but I'll save the evening through my epic communication and problem-solving skills, which total, by the way, to my bringing something chocolate for dessert. You can't kick a man out before dessert, he said to Astrid, who grinned at him. No, you can't, she added, looking at her mom over her shoulder. That wouldn't be nice. Garrett didn't try to hide his desire as his gaze shifted to Poppy. He held her gaze, daring her to return his invitation for more dinners together. He'd seen a flash of sexual response in her eyes earlier. He wanted more than a flash, more than a biological response, much more. A patient, methodical man by nature, he found himself impatient, wanting it all and wanting it now. Your mother, he said, never once taking his gaze from Poppy, is nice. I think I'll make it to dessert. Poppy didn't miss a beat. Not that nice, sir. If you want to make it through dinner, that better be some irresistible dessert. Garrett laughed, a true laugh. It surprised him almost as much as it seemed to surprise Poppy. It will be, I promise. That was one promise he was going to keep. Where he was going to find something Poppy would find irresistible and chocolate, he didn't know. What he did know was who to ask. He moved on to card number 2 with both feet and a feeling of dread. Instability, conflict, and loss. Here I come. Garrett hoped it would be worth it, knowing the question he asked as he shuffled the cards had very little to do with dinner. Beth peeked her head into Robert's office. He was busy crunching numbers on the outdated adding machine he loved, alternating between that and the open laptop in front of him. She took a moment to absorb his familiar features. Robert was older than she was by a decade or so. Not so great a distance in the grand scheme of things. There had been a great disparity between Robert and his second wife. Still, the age difference seemed to bother Robert now. Beth silently harumphed. Everything bothered Robert now. He was a stubborn, crotchety old man when it came to relationships that involved sex. He wanted the sex, he just didn't want the relationship. If Beth didn't already love the old sod, she'd kick his ass to the curb. The problem was, he owned the curb, where she worked most of the time. That wouldn't stop her from kicking him out of her bed if he didn't shape up soon. Neither of them was getting any younger, and she was getting sick of waiting for something he may never be open enough to give. Robert looked up from his work, sensing her presence. He looked mildly irritated with the interruption. Then he smiled appreciatively at her. He sat back in his chair, took off the cheap grocery shop cheaters he wore whenever he was crunching numbers, and set them on the desk. He patted his lap, beckoning her to take up temporary residence there. "Close the door," he said huskily. Heat flashed through her that had nothing to do with menopause and everything to do with appreciation and need. That pissed her off. Beth stood up straight, opened the door wider. She wanted to take him inside her as she'd done so often after surprising him in his office. So often, in fact, he'd added an oversized couch precisely for that purpose. Beth narrowed her eyes at him and scowled. There was no other way to describe the sound that came out of her, unheeded, but not unwelcome, than a growl. Robert's brows knit together as he sat up straighter. He looked confused and surprised. Both reactions irritated Beth further. She wasn't his to command. She wasn't a dog to come when called. She certainly wasn't a woman to sit on a man's lap simply because he asked, damn it. She was a strong, independent woman. And at this moment, she'd had quite enough of authoritarian men like Robert Oakley who took too much for granted. "Your son's here," she said matter-of-factly. Then she did something she'd never done before. She ordered him around. Looking him up and down, she lifted her chin and chilled her eyes, letting him know she found him wanting. She didn't, and that pissed her off too. "And take a comb to your hair. You may want to change your shirt before you go." She left him looking down at his shirt, a shirt that was perfectly presentable. That, and the stunned look on Robert's face, made Beth feel much better. I'm going to read the beginning of chapter 15 because it fits in with the dessert, and it doesn't really explain why we're seeing Beth, and when we're chopping it up, you don't really get that feel. But Beth is the pastry chef, and she not only excels at making desserts, she makes the best ones in Door County. So, chapter 15, which I will read again to you tomorrow, but I'll give you the first bit of it. "I need something irresistible," Garrett said, speaking to his father face to face for the first time in over a year. "And it needs to be chocolate." All right, we'll pick back up there tomorrow. And I wanted to show you the cards one more time. So this is the 3 of Pentacles. And this is the 6 of Swords. And this is the 5 of Swords. You can see why I just love this deck. These cards are so beautiful. Well, thank you. Hold great thoughts for Devon and Cornwall International Novel Prize. And I'll see you tomorrow, folks. Thank you for spending time with me. Bye.